The city was built of stone and spite. Huddled at the foot of the northern mountains, the cobblestones held a grudge against the warmth, radiating a damp chill that seeped through the soles of boots and the pads of paws alike. It was a gray place, forever living in the shadow of the peaks. High above the narrow streets, perched on the rim of a crumbling chimney stack, a small shape lay motionless. To a casual observer, it resembled nothing more than a pile of soot left by a sweep, a smudge of darkness against the slate roof. But the smudge breathed. This was Knox. Beauty had never been part of his equation. Lacking the sleek, panther-like grace of the purebreds or the fluffy charm of the house cats dozing on silk cushions, Knox was a creature of the edges. Fur the color of a dying fire, a rough, matted ash gray, allowed him to vanish against the mortar of the walls. A jagged notch in one ear, taken by a rat or a rival in a winter long past, marked him as a survivor, while his tail hooked crookedly at the tip. Yet it was the eyes that unsettled the humans. Not green nor blue, but a pale, washed-out amber, staring like two small, cold suns out of a storm cloud. They were eyes that did not beg, they assessed. Stretching against the rough clay bricks, claws scraping faintly, Knox felt the heat from the chimney fading. The fire below had died down, leaving him exposed to the biting wind. A sharp, twisting contraction gripped his stomach. Hunger, his oldest and most persistent companion, demanded attention. Descending from the roof required a liquid, heavy gravity. Pouring himself down the drainpipe and onto the high garden wall, no sound betrayed his movement. Silence was the only currency he possessed. Silence bought time, and time bought survival. Dropping into the alley behind the bakery, an intoxicating cloud of scents enveloped him. Warm yeast, burnt sugar, and the heavy, salty tang of rising dough hung in the damp air. Crouching behind a rain barrel, pale amber eyes fixed on the back door. It stood cracked open just an inch, spilling a sliver of golden light onto the wet stones. Inside, the baker moved with violent energy. A mountain of a man, red-faced and heavy-handed, slamming trays and shouting at the air. A man who despised small, quiet things. Knox waited. The rhythm of the boots dictated the opportunity. Thump, turn, thump, turn. Near the threshold lay a crust of bread, hard, covered in sawdust, but rich in calories. Distance, 10 feet. Hind legs tensed, muscles coiling like springs. There was no run, only a gray blur shooting across the gap, jaws clamped around the crust. Creak. A treacherous floorboard groaned. The baker spun around, face turning a shade of purple. You filthy omen. Instead of a broom, a heavy hand reached for the kettle on the cast-iron stove. Steam plumed into the air, signaling the arc of the scalding water. Scrambling backward, claws tearing at the wood of the door frame for traction, Knox threw himself into the alley. Splash. Boiling water hit the stones where he had been a heartbeat before, hissing aggressively in the cold air. Get out! The scream followed him, accompanied by a hurling rolling pin that splintered against the wall inches above his head. And take your bad luck with you. Panic fueled the flight. Scrambling up the rough wooden fence, the bread was abandoned in the desperate need for escape. Dropping into the safety of the next alley, he landed hard in a puddle of oily water, not stopping until 3 streets lay between him and the steam. Skidding to a halt in the shadow of a derelict wagon, chest heaving, the immediate danger passed, leaving only emptiness behind. Sitting on the cold stones, he licked a paw, smoothing the fur on his face in a gesture of defiance. Fine, the motion suggested. I do not care. But the cold cared. It settled deep into his bones. Above, the sky turned a bruised, unnatural purple as the sun dipped below the jagged line of the mountains. It looked weak today, smaller, as if retreating from a world that no longer welcomed it. Golden light spilled from the windows of the row houses, taunting him with glimpses of warmth. Families gathered around tables. Fat, lazy cats slept on rugs. A bitter, cold hatred rose in his throat. They locked their doors. They hoarded the heat. To them, he was nothing but dirt. Let them rot, the sentiment growled in his mind. I need no one. Curling a tail around his nose, prepared to sleep in the mud, he closed his eyes. Then a sound broke the rhythm of the rain. Not a threat. A soft, rhythmic squeak. Rubber shoes on wet stone. Opening one eye, Knox watched the end of the alley. A figure stood there. Small, wrapped in an oversized coat, face pale and smudged with soot. Muscles tensed, ready to bolt. Boys threw stones. Boys pulled tails. But this boy remained still. Silent. He simply stood there, holding something in his hands. Something that steamed. Steam rose from the boy's hands. A white, swirling ghost dancing in the freezing air. It carried a scent so rich, so heavy, with savory promise, that it nearly brought the starving cat to his knees. Warm dough, minced meat, onions cooked in fat. It was the smell of a life Knox had never known, a life lived inside, near the hearth. The boy did not throw the food. He did not use it as bait to lure a victim into kicking range. Instead, kneeling slowly on the damp pavement, ignoring the mud that stained the knees of his trousers, the small human broke the pastry in half. Here. The whisper came again, barely louder than the falling rain, or the shadow. Instinct screamed to run. Every scar on Knox's body was a lesson in the cruelty of two legs. Trust was a trap. Kindness was usually the prelude to a blow. But the heat radiating from the broken bun was a siren song. Muscles twitching with indecision, Knox crept forward. Low to the ground, belly brushing the wet stones, he moved like smoke, ready to evaporate at the first sign of danger. The boy remained frozen, a statue of patience. Only his eyes moved, tracking the approach, shining with a strange, wet gloss in the gloom. Reaching the offering, Knox snatched the food. Teeth sank into the soft warmth. The flavor exploded in his mouth. Salt, grease, sustenance. It was devoured in seconds, swallowed almost whole, the heat of it spreading through his chest like a small internal sun. Expecting the boy to leave now that the amusement was over, Knox licked his chops, preparing to retreat back into the dark. But the hand remained extended. Fingers, pale and thin, hovered in the air. They were not clenched in a fist. They were open. "You aren't a monster," the boy murmured, his voice cracking slightly. "You're just cold." Then came the touch. Knox flinched, eyes squeezing shut, bracing for the impact. But there was no pain. Only a gentle, rhythmic scratching behind the ears. The fingers worked through the matted, ash-gray fur, finding the exact spot where the tension of the day had gathered. A shockwave of sensation rolled down the cat's spine. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. For the first time in his memory, a hand was adding something to his life, rather than taking it away. Leaning into the touch, against his better judgment, Knox let out a sound. Not a growl nor a hiss, but a rough, rusty vibration deep in his throat. A purr. It was a broken sound, unused for years, but it was there. The boy smiled. It was a weak, tired smile, but it illuminated the alley more than the street lamps ever could. "My name is Leo," the child whispered, as if sharing a state secret. Knox looked up. Pale amber eyes met watery blue ones. In that exchange, a contract was signed, not on paper, but in the blood. This was not one of them, the shouting giants, the kickers, the throwers of water. This was a cub, a runt, a creature who, like Nox, seemed to live on the edge of the pack, shivering in a coat that was too thin for the coming winter. A sudden, harsh cough racked the boy's small frame. Leo doubled over, his chest heaving, the sound wet and rattling. The hand withdrew from the cat's head to cover his mouth. When the fit passed, Leo looked paler, the skin around his eyes bruised with exhaustion. "I have to go," he wheezed, wiping his mouth. "Before the sun goes down. They say it's going to be a long night." He stood up, swaying slightly. "Stay safe, Shadow." Turning, Leo walked back toward the street, his small figure swallowed by the mist. Nox sat alone in the alley. The food was gone, the hand was gone, but the warmth remained. It settled in his belly and, more dangerously, in his chest. A tether had been forged. Watching the boy disappear, Nox felt a new sensation, sharper than hunger and colder than the rain. Fear, not for himself. He could survive the cold. He was made of it. But the boy was fragile. Ideally, the sun would rise tomorrow to warm him. Nox looked at the western horizon. The purple bruise of the sky had darkened to an unnatural, suffocating black. The sun had dipped below the peaks, vanishing with a finality that felt wrong. The air grew still. It was not just night falling. It was a door closing. Clocks in the city chimed the hour of dawn, 6 heavy bronze notes ringing out across the rooftops. But the sky refused to answer. The horizon remained a sealed eyelid, black and swollen, denying the world its morning. Usually, the night retreats. It grays, it softens, it yields to the inevitable pressure of the sun. But this darkness was solid. It sat upon the chimneys like a physical weight, pressing the smoke back down into the hearths. Hours bled into hours. 7, 8, 9. The street lamps, which should have flickered out, continued to burn. Tiny, ineffective pinpricks of amber drowning in an ocean of ink. Confusion turned to panic in the streets below. Shutters banged open. Anxious faces peered upward, breath pluming in the freezing air, searching for a sun that had abandoned its post. Whispers of eclipse turned into murmurs of curse. High on the baker's roof, curled against the cooling bricks, Nox watched the world freeze. The temperature plummeted. It was an unnatural, aggressive drop. Frost didn't just fall, it grew. Jagged, crystalline thorns erupted from the water troughs, freezing the surface into opaque mirrors within minutes. The wind died, leaving behind a silence so absolute it made the ears ring. But the cold was not the worst thing. The shadow was. It crept through the cracks in the window frames. It seeped under the doors. A gray, spiritual malaise that hunted the smallest and the weakest. Drawn by the invisible tether forged in the alley, the memory of the warm bread and the gentle hand, Nox navigated the treacherous, icy tiles. Reaching the dormer window of the attic, he cleared a circle in the frost with a swipe of his paw. He peered inside. The room was dim, lit only by a sputtering tallow candle. Leo lay beneath a mountain of quilts, yet the mound shook violently. The boy's skin had lost the flush of life, turning the color of old parchment. His lips were blue, but it was his eyes that terrified the watching cat. They were open, staring at the ceiling, but they were empty. The spark was gone. The doença da sombra, shadow sickness, had latched onto him. Without the sun to burn it away, the boy was fading, becoming transparent. turning into just another shade in the gray city. Knox pressed his nose against the glass. "Wake up," the instinct urged. "Fight." But Leo did not move. The cold was inside him now. A realization settled over the ash-gray cat, heavy as the snow that was beginning to fall. The fires of men were useless. Wood and coal could warm the skin, but they could not warm the soul. Only one fire was strong enough to burn away this sickness. Knox looked up at the mountains. They loomed in the north, jagged teeth biting into the black sky. The highest peak, the Zenith, was buried in clouds, a place where the wind flayed the rock and the air was too thin to breathe. Legend whispered among the alley cats that the sun didn't just set, it rested. It slept in the cradle of the highest stone. If it was sleeping, perhaps it could be woken. Humans could not make the climb. They were too heavy, too loud, too dependent on their maps and their logic. But a cat walks between worlds. A cat can find a path where there is only a ledge. Knox looked back at the boy one last time. Leo's chest hitched. The candle flickered, close to dying. If the candle went out, the boy went out. Knox turned away from the window. He turned away from the city that hated him. He faced the north. The hunger in his belly was forgotten. The ache in his scar was ignored. With a low growl that sounded like a stone grinding against a tomb, the ash cat took his first step toward the impossible ascent. The pilgrimage had begun. Chapter 2. The Call of the North. Fear has a specific density. It is heavier than the mist that clings to the riverbanks in autumn, and sharper than the scent of pine needles crushed underfoot. In the city of stone and spite, fear had become the atmosphere itself. It hung in the narrow alleyways, suspended in the freezing air, a tangible weight that pressed against the chest and made every breath a labor of effort. The unnatural night had stretched on for cycles that no longer had names. Was it Tuesday? Was it a week since the sun last touched the slate roofs? The clocks continued to tick in their towers, blindly marking seconds that had lost their meaning, but the rhythm of life had broken. Without the dawn to scrub the world clean, the shadows had been allowed to fester, growing long, thick, and confident. Moving through this suspended twilight required a different kind of navigation. Knox did not walk. He poured himself along the edges of the buildings. His rough, ash-gray fur brushed against the limestone walls, seeking the faintest memory of absorbed heat, but finding only the biting chill of the grave. The cobblestones beneath his paws were coated in a layer of hoarfrost, so thick it looked like a carpet of crushed diamonds. It crunched softly with every step, a sound that seemed deafening in the profound, suffocating silence. This was not the quiet of sleep. It was the quiet of holding one's breath in the dark. In the market square, where once merchants shouted and carts rattled, a new desperate ritual was taking place. Humans had gathered. Drawn together by the primitive instinct that whispers safety in numbers, they huddled around a massive makeshift bonfire. Furniture dragged from parlors, crates smashed into kindling, even books thrown into the pile. Everything was being fed to the flames. But the fire was wrong. It burned with a violent, angry orange hue, spitting sparks that spiraled up into the void, only to die before they reached the height of the chimneys. It roared and cracked, consuming the wood with a ravenous hunger, yet it gave off no comfort. The heat it produced was strange, thin and superficial. It scorched the faces of those standing closest, turning their skin red and raw, but it did not penetrate the cold that had settled in their marrow. Standing in the shadows of a gargoyle-adorned gutter, Knox watched them. They looked like statues carved from gray ice. Their eyes were hollow, reflecting the dancing flames but holding no light of their own. They did not speak to one another. They did not touch. They simply stared into the fire, waiting for a sun that refused to rise, terrified that if they looked away, the fire would vanish too. A woman stood apart from the group, clutching a bundle of firewood to her chest, as if it were a child. Her knuckles were white, the skin cracked from the dry cold. She turned, her gaze sweeping across the dark perimeter of the square. For a moment, her eyes locked onto the small gray shape crouching in the gloom. In the days of light, she would have hissed. She would have stomped a heavy boot or thrown a stone to chase the vermin away. Tonight she did nothing. The hatred that usually fueled the city had frozen along with the water troughs. There was no energy left for malice. Gone. Her lips moved, shaping the word without sound, a puff of white vapor escaping her mouth to be swallowed by the night. It's all gone. She looked through the cat, past him, into the abyss that swallowed the end of the street. Knox felt a flicker of something unfamiliar in his chest. It wasn't pity. Pity is a luxury for the well-fed, but it was a recognition of shared doom. She was prey now, just like him. The darkness hunted them both. Turning away from the fire that offered no warmth, the ash-gray cat continued his patrol. The city felt abandoned, yet it was full. The other animals, the soft, pampered house, cats who wore collars of silk and slept on goose-down duvets, had vanished. They were hiding. Knox could smell their fear drifting from the cellar grates and the cracks in the floorboards. They were huddled in the darkest corners of the basements, wrapped in old wool, paralyzed by the instinct that told them the sky had fallen. They were waiting for the end. But waiting is a form of dying. Knox was a creature of the street. He knew that survival was a verb. It required movement. His hunger was a sharp, twisting knife in his gut, a constant reminder of the emptiness. But he pushed it down. There was a heavier weight driving him tonight. The image of the boy, Leo, the memory of the small, pale hand resting on his head, the sensation of the fever burning through the boy's skin, the blue tint of the lips in the candlelight. If the sun did not return, the boy would fade. He would become just another shadow in a city of ghosts. The wind picked up, a low moan that funneled through the narrow streets like a voice mourning the dead. It carried ice crystals that stung the eyes and coated the whiskers in silver. Knox lowered his head against the gale. He needed answers. He knew the streets, the rooftops, the quickest way to steal a fish head. But he did not know the mountains. The peaks that loomed to the north were a foreign country, a jagged silhouette of black rock and white death that pierced the sky. Legend spoke of them. Whispers passed down from mother to kitten in the safety of the haylofts. Stories of the peak of morning. But stories are slippery things. They change with the telling. He needed the truth. He needed the keeper of the old words. Changing course, Knox left the market square behind. He headed toward the old quarter, the part of the city where the cobblestones gave way to ancient Roman dirt. Here, the ruins of the old walls still stood, crumbling arches of stone that dated back to a time before the city had a name. It was a place of ghosts and rats. The rats were bold tonight. Huge, sleek bodies moved in the gutters, their eyes glowing red in the darkness. They chattered and squeaked, sensing the weakness of the world above. They knew the humans were fading. They were preparing to inherit the stone. A large rat, scarred and missing a tail, blocked the path, rising on its hind legs to hiss. Nox didn't slow down. He didn't posture. He didn't growl. He simply flowed forward, a relentless tide of gray fur and muscle. He fixed the rat with his pale amber eyes, eyes that held the coldness of the coming winter. The rat flinched. It saw something in the cat's gaze that was not fear. It saw a singular, terrifying purpose. The rat scrambled aside, diving into a drain. Nox passed without breaking stride. He was not hunting rats tonight. He was hunting a god. The ruins loomed ahead, jagged teeth against the starless sky. Somewhere in that maze of fallen stone and ivy, the oldest cat in the city lived. The one who remembered the names of the stars. The one who knew the path to the zenith. The cold bit deeper, freezing the mud between his toes. But the ash cat did not stop. The pilgrimage had begun in the blood, and now it would continue in the stone. The old quarter did not belong to the humans anymore. It was a skeleton of the city that had been, a labyrinth of Roman arches and crumbled masonry, where the mortar had turned to dust centuries ago. Here, the cobblestones gave way to packed earth, frozen hard as iron, and the modern buildings of brick were replaced by the jagged, broken teeth of ancient limestone walls. Ivy, stripped of its leaves by the unnatural winter, clung to the ruins like veins of silver wire, freezing the stones in a chokehold of ice. The wind sang, a different song in these hollow spaces, a hollow whistling tune that sounded like breath blowing across the mouth of a bottle. Navigating the debris required a specific, fluid grace. Ash-gray fur brushed against rough stone as Nox slipped through a fissure in a collapsed wall. The noise of the desperate city, the bonfires, the coughing, the distant slamming of doors faded away, swallowed by the density of history. Here, the silence was respectful. It was the silence of a library or a crypt. Deep within the belly of the ruins, sheltered by a slab of granite that had fallen 1,000 years prior, lay the sanctorum. It was not a place marked by signs or scents obvious to the two-legged kind. To a human, it was just a dark hole beneath a pile of rocks. To the felines of the city, it was the library of ash. The scent hit the nose first, a dry, potent aroma of dried sage, old fur, and the dust of crushed moths. It was the smell of something that had stopped moving a long time ago, but refused to die. Nox paused at the entrance to the den. He lowered his head, pressing his chin to the cold earth in a gesture of submission that went against every instinct of his street-hardened nature. "Grandmother," he whispered into the dark. The sound didn't travel far. The shadows seemed to eat it. For a long moment, there was no response. Only the slow, rhythmic dripping of condensation from the stone ceiling broke the quiet. Plip, plip, plip. Then the darkness shifted. Two eyes opened in the gloom. They were not bright and predatory like the eyes of the alley cats. They were clouded, milky white, with cataracts, seeing a world that overlaid the physical one. The matriarch emerged, but time had bleached the orange and black patches of her coat until she was a mottled map of grays and whites. Her movements were slow, each joint articulating with a dry click, yet she carried herself with the terrifying dignity of a deposed queen. She did not sniff him. She did not need to. "The ash won," her voice rasped, sounding like dry leaves rubbing together in the autumn. "You carry the smell of the boy, and the smell of the dying candle." Nox did not flinch. The elders knew things that the wind told them. "The sun is gone, grandmother," Nox said, his voice tight. "The frost is eating the stone." The matriarch settled onto a bed of dried moss. wrapping her thin tail around her paws. The sun rests, she corrected gently. It has grown tired of watching the cruelty of the streets. It has retreated to the high place to sleep. She lifted a paw, pointing blindly toward the north, where the jagged silhouette of the mountains cut into the starless sky. The peak of morning, she murmured, the zenith. That is where the great burning eye closes its lid. How do I wake it? Knox asked. The question hung in the freezing air, sharp and desperate. The matriarch let out a low, wheezing laugh. You? A scrap of soot. From the gutter? Miss, you wish to wake a god? The boy is fading, Knox insisted, the image of Leo's blue lips flashing in his mind. The fire in the hearth is not enough. He needs the fire in the sky. The old cat grew serious. The milky eyes seemed clear for a second, focusing on something far beyond the stone walls. To wake the sun, she recited, drawing the words from a memory older than the city. One must carry a spark to the summit, not a torch, not a coal, but a spark of will. She leaned forward, the smell of ancient dust washing over him. The mountain is not made of rock, little Ash. It is made of tests. The wind there will strip the fur from your skin. The cold will try to stop your heart. The silence will try to eat your name. She paused, letting the weight of the warning settle. Many have climbed. The leopard, the wolf, the bear. None returned. They are frozen in the ice, statues of their own ambition. I am not ambitious, Knox said quietly. I am just necessary. The matriarch tilted her head. She sensed the difference. The others had climbed for glory, to claim the sun. This one climbed because he had no other choice. The path is hidden, she whispered. It winds through the forest of whispers, crosses the bridge of glass, and ascends the staircase of clouds. It is a path for spirits, not for flesh. She reached out, touching his torn ear with a cold, dry nose. If you go, Knox, you leave the world of men behind. You enter the world of the ancients, and the ancients do not bargain. Knox stood up. The cold of the damp earth seeped into his paws, but the fire in his belly, the fire ignited by the boy's kindness, burned hotter. I do not want to bargain, he said. I want the light. The matriarch nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable. Then go, she commanded, before the ice seals the pass. Go, Ashcat, and do not look back. Backing out of the den, Knox left the sanctuary of the ruins. He stepped back out under the open, suffocating sky. The wind caught his fur, pulling him north. The legend was real. The path was set. Leaving the shelter of the old quarter, he moved toward the city gates. The buildings thinned out. The cobblestones gave way to the frozen mud of the road. Ahead, the great white bulk of the mountain loomed, a sleeping giant waiting to be disturbed. The pilgrimage had moved from the mind to the map. Before the wild took him, there was one debt left to acknowledge. Leaving the ancient dust of the old quarter, the ash-gray cat did not head immediately for the gates. Instead, he wove a path through the sleeping streets, moving against the wind, drawn back toward the center of the town, where the buildings stood tallest. The bakery was dark. The chimney, usually breathing a plume of yeast-scented smoke, was cold. The heavy wooden sign creaked on its hinges, a rhythmic groan of wood chafing against iron in the gale. Scaling the rough stucco of the wall required a grip of iron. Claws, worn from the hard stones of the street, dug into the plaster, hauling the small, tired body up toward the attic dormer. The window was crusted with thick, opaque fern patterns of ice. Balancing on the narrow ledge, the wind threatening to peel him from the wall, Knox raised a paw. He scraped at the frost. Scritch, scritch. A small circle of clear glass appeared, a peephole into the sick room. Inside, the candle had burned down to a pool of tallow, the wick drowning in its own grease, casting a frantic, dying light. Leo lay beneath a mound of quilts that seemed too heavy for his small frame. The change was terrifying. In the few hours since the alley, the shadow sickness had advanced. It was no longer just a fever, it was a thief. The color had been drained from the boy's face, leaving the skin translucent, revealing the blue veins beneath like a map of rivers in a drought. But it was the air around the bed that stopped Knox's heart. A gray, sluggish mist coiled around the bedposts. It was not smoke. It was the physical manifestation of the cold. A parasite made of gloom, feeding on the boy's heat, drinking his breaths before he could fully take them. Leo turned in his sleep, a whimper escaping his cracked lips. Cold, the boy murmured, the word barely a vapor. Knox pressed his forehead against the freezing glass. The barrier was absolute. He could scratch, he could yowl, he could break the window, but what then? Curling up on the boy's chest might offer warmth for an hour. It might buy a single night. But the night was eternal now. A temporary fire could not fight an endless winter. To save the boy, the source of the cold had to be broken. The cure was not in the room, it was on the peak. A profound, silent communication passed through the glass. Hold on, the amber eyes projected into the room. Do not let the gray take you. I am going to fetch the fire. It was a promise made to a sleeping child, the most binding kind of contract a guardian can sign. Turning away from the window required a physical tearing of the will. Every instinct shouted to stay, to guard, to remain in the known radius of the city. But the compass in the chest pointed north. Descending the wall, paws hit the frozen mud of the street with a finality that echoed in the quiet. The run to the city gates was a blur of gray stone and black shadows. The few remaining street lamps were flickering out, their oil reserves spent, surrendering the streets to the encroaching void. Passing the iron gates of the city, the texture of the world changed. The cobblestones ended, the order of men ended. Ahead lay the tundra. It was a vast open expanse of white rolling hills that rose toward the tree line of the great forest. The snow here was not the slush of the streets. It was a pristine, deadly powder, deep enough to swallow a cat whole. The wind, no longer broken by buildings, hit with the force of a solid wall. It screamed across the open ground, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles. Knox paused at the threshold. Looking back, the city was a cluster of dark shapes, a dying ember in a sea of ash. Somewhere in that cluster was the boy. Looking forward, the mountain loomed. It was invisible in the dark, a massive absence of stars against the black sky. But its presence was a gravitational pull. It felt ancient. It felt indifferent. Stepping off the road, the first paw sank into the deep snow. The cold was shocking. It bit instantly through the fur, clamping around the ankle like a trap. Knox shivered, his ears flattening against the gale. He was small. He was alone. He was walking into the throat of the winter. But the image of the blue lips in the candlelight burned in his mind, a hot coal of purpose. Lifting his head, he let out a low growl, a challenge to the wind. He took another step, then another. Leaving the world of men behind, the pilgrim entered the wild. Chapter 3. The White Forest. The transition from the frozen mud of the road to the deep snow of the forest was not gradual. It was a sudden immersion into a new element. One moment, the ground was hard, unyielding earth that rang beneath the paws. The next, the world dissolved into powder. Stepping off the beaten path, the ash-gray cat sank. The snow here was not the packed, dirty slush of the city streets. It was pristine, untouched, and deceptively soft. It swallowed the leg up to the shoulder, a cold, dry dust that offered no resistance and no support. To walk in, it was to swim. Each step became a laborious cycle. Lift the leg high, clear of the drift, extend it forward, and press down, hoping for a crust that would hold the weight. Crunch, sink, drag, crunch, sink, drag. The rhythm was slow, exhausting, and maddeningly quiet. The forest loomed ahead, a towering wall of black pines that seemed to hold up the starless sky. Entering the tree line, the wind died instantly. The gale that had screamed across the open tundra was blocked by the density of the wood, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like pressure in the ears. It was the silence of a cathedral after the doors are locked, the silence of deep water. Knox stopped, panting, his breath blooming in white clouds that hung suspended in the still air before dissipating. He looked around. The world had been drained of color. There was only the black of the tree trunks, rough, scaly bark that looked like charred bone, and the blinding, luminous white of the snow. The shadows here were not cast by light, for there was no moon and no sun. They were pooled in the hollows between the roots, deep wells of violet darkness that seemed to possess a gravity of their own. Navigating this monochrome labyrinth required a recalibration of the senses. Vision was useless. The lack of contrast played tricks on the mind, making distant trees look like looming giants and snowdrifts look like crouching beasts. Knox closed his eyes for a moment, letting his other instruments take over. He swiveled his ears, straining against the velvet quiet. Crack. The sound of a branch snapping under the weight of ice, miles away. Thump. The sound of a clump of snow falling from a high bough. And underneath it all, the sound of the forest itself breathing, a slow, resinous exhalation of pine needles and cold sap. It smelled clean here, dangerously clean. There was no scent of rot, no scent of man, no scent of garbage to guide him. Just the sharp, metallic tang of ice and the dry odor of frozen wood. He pushed on. The cold was different here. In the city, the cold was damp. It soaked into you. Here, the cold was dry and sharp. It did not soak. It bit. It nipped at the tips of his ears, turning them numb. It hardened the pads of his feet until they felt like stones. He had to keep moving. To stop was to freeze. To freeze was to become part of the sculpture garden of the winter. He thought of the boy, Leo. He summoned the memory of the warm hand on his head. He visualized the heat as a physical object, a coal burning in the center of his chest. Move, the coal commanded. Burn. He drove his legs forward, plowing a furrow through the drifts. He was a small gray blemish on the perfection of the white page, writing a story of survival with every struggling step. But the forest was not as empty as it seemed. As he moved deeper into the woods, the hair on the back of his neck began to rise. It was not the wind. It was not the cold. It was the sensation of eyes. Something was watching. The feeling was prickling and distinct, a phantom touch between the shoulder blades. Knox paused, one paw raised in mid-step. He scanned the tree line. The black trunks stood like bars of a cage, identical and endless. Nothing moved. No bird fluttered. No squirrel chattered. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a held breath. Someone, or something, was waiting. He lowered his paw slowly into the snow, making no sound. He did not run. Running triggers the chase. He walked, but his muscles were coiled, ready to explode. He kept his tail low, his profile small. He was no longer just a pilgrim. He was prey, and the hunter was close. The silence of the wood did not break. It thickened. Drifting on the stagnant air, cutting through the clean aroma of pine and ice, came a scent that triggered a primal alarm in the hindbrain. Wet fur, dry saliva, old blood. It was the olfactory signature of a stomach that had been empty for too long. Motion ceased instantly. A gray belly pressed into the powder, transforming the cat into a hummock of ash amidst the white field. To turn the head was to show fear. Instead, ears swiveled backward, straining to catch the crunch of a paw on the crust. But the snow kept its secrets. The predator knew the terrain as intimately as the pilgrim. Yet eyes cannot be hidden in the eternal night. To the left, between the gnarled roots of a black oak, 2 points of light ignited. Not the warm amber of a lantern, nor the cold blue of the stars, but a sickly, bioluminescent green, glowing with a desperate fever. Then a second pair flickered into existence on the right, and a third. Knox was not being stalked. He was being corralled. Shadows detached themselves from the tree line, taking solid form. Wolves. But these were not the majestic silver lords of legend. These were the shadow wolves, gaunt, skeletal specters stripped of glory by the long darkness, ribs pressed against mangy hides like the rungs of a ladder, lips pulled back in permanent snarls to expose pale, bloodless gums. They moved without growling. Growling wastes energy. With terrifying economy, massive paws placed silently in the depressions left by the wind, the circle began to close. The geometry of death was clear. Deep snow would be a grave for short legs. In a sprint, the drifts would swallow the cat, while the long stilt-like limbs of the pack would paddle over the surface with ease. Trapped in the open, the options narrowed. Emerging from the gloom, the leader of the pack stepped forward. A massive brute with one eye clouded by a cataract. A heavy head lowered, sniffing the air, tasting the fear. Little meat, the posture suggested. Hardly a mouthful, but a mouthful is life. A hiss erupted from the cat's chest. A low, vibrating sound of defiance. Fur fluffed, spine arched. A desperate bluff against giants. The wolves did not blink. They knew the difference between a threat and a snack. The circle tightened. Above, the trees offered a mocking sanctuary. Old pines, stripped bare by deer, left trunks smooth and unclimbable for the first 10 feet. Except for one. A sapling, thin and flexible, twisted around the base of a larger tree like a wooden snake. Fragile, barely a whip, but a bridge to the higher canopy. Distance, 5 feet. The leader bunched haunches, muscles rippling under loose skin, preparing the lunge. There was no waiting for the snap of jaws. Explosion. The launch was not away from the wolf, but toward the tree. Impact with the snow kicked up a blinding cloud of white powder, a momentary screen to confuse the eyes. Jaws snapped shut on empty air, and snowflakes with a sound like a bear trap springing. Clack. Claws struck the sapling. Digging into freezing bark coated in ice, terror served as a powerful adhesive. Back paws scrabbled for purchase, bark flying in splinters as the ascent began. A second wolf leaped, teeth snapping inches from the trailing tail. The hot breath of the beast, the wind of the bite, washed over the cat's flank, hauling the body higher, scrambling onto the safety of the first sturdy bough. Air rushed back into burning lungs. Below, the pack gathered. No barking, no jumping, They simply sat in the snow, arranging themselves in a perfect circle around the base of the tree. 12 green eyes fixed upward. They had nowhere to go. The darkness was endless, and their patience was infinite. They would wait for the cold to knock the meal down. Looking down at them, then up at the canopy, a new path revealed itself. Branches interlaced overhead, forming a road of needles and wood stretching north. The ground was forbidden now. The floor was death. Survival meant becoming a creature of the air. Testing the balance on the swaying branch, the ash cat looked north. The path was thin and treacherous. "Watch me." The whisper was lost in the wind. Muscles coiled. The leap to the next tree began. High above the snowdrifts, the world was a lattice of black timber and frozen needles. Navigating the canopy required a precision that the cold attempted to steal with every step. Bark coated in a slick sheen of verglas offered little traction for claws dulled by the city stones. Balance became a negotiation with the wind, which hissed through the pine boughs, threatening to dislodge the small gray pilgrim and send him tumbling back into the waiting jaws below. There was no looking down. To look down was to see the green bioluminescence of the eyes, a constellation of hunger trailing the ascent. The pack did not rush. They flowed over the snowdrifts like oil, mirroring every movement made in the trees, a dark reflection tethered to the ground. Movement became a rhythm of desperate geometry. Crouch, calculate, leap. The gap between the pines varied, sometimes a mere hop, other times a terrifying chasm of empty, swirling air. Muscles burned with the buildup of lactic acid. The scar on the shoulder throbbed, a hot wire of pain pulsing in time with the heart. Yet, the aerial road offered a grim advantage. The wolves were heavy, the snow slowed them, the cat was light, the wood held him. Gradually, the distance between predator and prey began to widen. The sounds of snapping twigs and crunching crust grew fainter, swallowed by the acoustic dampening of the deep woods. But the forest had other traps. A massive, ancient oak stood in the path, its branches gnarled and twisted like the fingers of a witch frozen in casting a spell. The leap to the oak was significant. The target branch was thick but encased in ice. Launching from the pine, the air rushed past ears pinned flat against the skull. Impact. Claws struck the ice. They scraped, failing to bite into the hardwood beneath. Momentum carried the body forward, but gravity grabbed the hindquarters. A slip. A scramble. For a heart-stopping second, only the front paws held the purchase, the rest of the body dangling over the abyss. A whine escaped the throat, involuntary and sharp. Below, a shadow detached itself from the gloom. The alpha had kept pace. He sat at the base of the oak, looking up, mouth open in a patient, toothy grin. He knew the odds. Gravity always wins eventually. Summoning the last reserves of strength from the spine, a violent heave hauled the back legs up and over the branch. Collapsing onto the rough bark, breath came in jagged, painful gasps that fogged the air. Safe. For the moment. The oak offered more than just a perch. Higher up the trunk, where a lightning strike had scarred the wood decades ago, a dark cavity gaped, a hollow. Dragging the tired body upward, the sanctuary was reached. It was a tight squeeze, a womb of rotting wood insulated from the biting wind. Inside, the floor was covered in a bed of dry leaves and wood chips, debris left by squirrels or owls long departed. Crawling into the deepest recess of the hollow, the wind's scream was muffled to a dull roar. The smell was earthy and dry, a scent of dormancy. Curling into a tight ball, nose tucked under the tail to recycle the warmth of the breath, the shaking began to subside. From the ground far below, a single frustrated howl pierced the night. It was a sound of defeat. The pack was moving on. They could not wait for a statue to fall. There were other, easier things to kill in the dark. The silence returned, heavier than before. But in the hollow of the dead tree, a small engine of life continued to turn. Sleep pulled at the eyelids, a heavy, narcotic weight. To sleep here was dangerous, but to stay awake was impossible. The image of the candle in the window flickered in the mind's eye. Not yet, the thought drifted through the fatigue. Rest, then climb. The storm raged outside, but inside the wood, the ash cat drifted into a gray, dreamless doze, suspended between the earth that wanted to freeze him and the sky that refused to light his way. Chapter 4. The Canyon of Winds. Waking came not with the warmth of a rising sun, but with the stiff, aching realization that the cold had deepened during the hours of dormancy. Inside the hollow of the oak, the bed of dry leaves had frozen into a rigid mold, crunching softly under a shifting weight. Muscles, tight and heavy, with lactic acid, protested the command to move. The scar on the shoulder burned with a dull, throbbing heat, a localized fever in a landscape of ice. Emerging from the sanctuary of the wood required a supreme act of will. To leave the shelter was to accept the assault of the elements once more. Descending the rough bark of the trunk, the paws met the snow with a numbness that was almost merciful. The nerves in the pads had dulled, transmitting only the vaguest data about the terrain. Hard, cold, uneven. The forest began to thin. The dense protective lattice of pine boughs gave way to open sky, a vast crushing dome of obsidian darkness, starless and indifferent. Without the trees to break its momentum, the wind changed its character. It was no longer the mournful sigh of the woods. It became a physical force, a solid wall of moving air that shoved and pulled at the small gray form. The ground hardened. Deep drifts of snow were replaced by windswept rock, stripped bare and polished to a black sheen by the gale. Here, the incline sharpened. The pilgrimage shifted from a trek to a climb. Breath bloomed in ragged clouds, snatched away instantly by the updraft. Ahead, the path ended. The world simply dropped away. A chasm yawned in the darkness, a jagged wound in the earth, where the tectonic plates had pulled apart eons ago. It was the Gorge of Sighs, a vertical drop into a blackness so absolute that it seemed to have no bottom. From the depths, a sound rose. Oom! It was the voice of the mountain. The wind, funneling through the narrow throat of the canyon, accelerated to a scream. It carried the scent of ozone and crushed stone, a smell of violence. Standing on the precipice, the fur was flattened against the skin, the wind stripping away the fragile envelope of body heat. To go back was to freeze. To go forward was impossible. Or so it seemed. Spanning the void, a single precarious link remained. An ancient pine, felled by some forgotten storm of the previous century, lay across the gap. Its roots were torn from the earth on the near side, a tangled mass of frozen wood. Its crown was wedged into the rocks on the far bank. It was a bridge. But it was a bridge designed for the sure-footed ghosts of the mountain, not for the living. Decades of spray from the depths and freezing rain had coated the trunk in a casing of verglas, clear, hard ice. It shone in the gloom with a deceptive, wet luster. It was a cylinder of glass suspended over nothingness. The width was barely that of a man's torso. The length was 50 paces of terror. Crouching at the root ball, amber eyes assessed the surface. There was no texture, no bark to grip, no friction. A single slip would mean a slide into the abyss, a silent fall into the dark throat of the gorge. The wind buffeted the log, making it hum, a low-frequency vibration that traveled through the wood and into the paws resting on it. Fear, cold and rational, suggested a retreat. Find another way, the instinct whispered. Go down the valley. Find a cave. But the image of the attic window flashed in the mind, the candle drowning in its own wax, the boy's chest hitching. There was no time for the long way around. The direct path was the only path. Testing the surface, a front paw extended tentatively. The claws slid uselessly on the hard glaze. The pads found no purchase. Balance would have to be absolute. Center of gravity low. Tail used as a counterweight against the lateral gusts. It was not a walk. It would be a tightrope act, performed in a hurricane. A deep breath was taken, filling the lungs with the thin, sharp air. The decision settled in the gut, heavier than the fear. Leaving the stability of the rock, the ash cat stepped onto the ice. Reaching the midpoint of the span, the wind changed its tactic. Instead of the steady, pushing gale that had buffeted the crossing so far, the canyon exhaled a sudden, violent updraft. It struck the log from below. The bridge bucked. It vibrated with a resonant thrum that traveled up the legs and into the chest cavity. Gravity momentarily inverted. For a fraction of a second, the weight on the paws lifted. It was enough. Friction vanished. The front right paw slid outward, seeking wood and finding only air. The center of gravity tipped. Correction was attempted. A frantic scramble of the remaining limbs, but the ice offered no purchase. The slide was silent, smooth, and terrifyingly fast. The horizon tilted 90 degrees. The black rock of the cliff face spun. The body left the top of the log. There was no scream. The lungs were too busy crushing themselves in anticipation of the fall. The stomach dropped, that sickening lurch of free fall that turns the blood to water. But the fall was arrested. Instinct, faster than thought, had flared. As the body slid off the curve of the trunk, the front legs had hooked blindly over the side. Impact. The chest slammed into the side of the log. The breath was driven out in a sharp, pained grunt. Claws, finally finding a crack in the ice, or perhaps just driven deep into the wood by the sheer force of terror, locked. The fall stopped, but the safety was an illusion. Hanging by two paws, the rest of the body dangled over the abyss. The wind, sensing the vulnerability, attacked. It grabbed the hindquarters, swinging the hanging form back and forth like a pendulum. Left, right, left. The momentum threatened to peel the grip from the wood. Shoulders burned with white-hot fire. The muscles, already exhausted from the forest trek, screamed under the strain of supporting the entire body weight against the drag of the void. Vision blurred. Looking up, the curve of the log seemed impossibly high. The ice glinted mockingly in the gloom. Looking down was a mistake. The gorge seemed to be pulling. A gravitational hunger emanated from the deep, whispering that it would be so easy to let go. Let go, the wind hissed. The pain will stop. The cold will stop. Just open your claws. The grip slipped. The right paw slid a millimeter. A flake of bark broke off and fell, tumbling silently into the dark. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded the veins. No. The thought sparked in the primitive brain. Not here. Not like this. The image of the boy returned. Leo. The hand. The bread. If the cat fell, the boy died. It was a simple equation. A growl started low in the throat, a vibration of pure, stubborn refusal. Muscles trembled, vibrating with the effort. The back legs flailed, seeking purchase on the slippery underside of the log. Claws scratched uselessly against the verglass. Scritch, scritch. Then, a knot. The left hind claw caught a tiny protrusion of frozen sap. It wasn't a ledge. It was barely a bump, but it was leverage. Putting every ounce of remaining energy into that single point of contact, the spine arched, a heave, a grunt. The chin hooked over the top of the log, then a shoulder. Scrabbling, kicking, fighting the ice with the desperation of a drowning swimmer climbing a muddy bank. The gray form hauled itself back up, collapsing onto the top of the trunk, belly pressed flat against the treacherous glass. The heart hammered against the ribs like a trapped bird, alive, still on the wire. But the bridge was not finished, and the wind was rising. Lying flat on the spine of the fallen giant, the wood beneath the belly felt less like a bridge and more like a tombstone. The adrenaline that had fueled the desperate scramble for survival began to ebb, receding like a tide, leaving behind the wreckage of the effort. In its wake, sensation returned with a vengeance. A sharp, hot throb pulsed in the right forepaw, the limb that had borne the brunt of the arrest. It wasn't the dull ache of the cold. It was the stinging, specific bite of torn flesh. But to stop was to freeze. The wind, momentarily cheated of its prize, redoubled its efforts, shrieking through the gorge, buffeting the log with invisible hammers. Movement resumed. Gone was the attempt at balance or grace. The crossing became a crawl. Belly dragging against the ice, claws of the remaining 3 sound legs hooking into the micro fissures of the glaze, the ash cat pulled himself forward. Drag, wince, drag, wince. The far bank loomed closer, a shelf of black granite dusted with snow. It looked like the promised land. 10 paces. 5. The roots of the log, tangled in the rocks of the destination, offered a final, chaotic ladder. Scrambling over the twisted wood, slipping on the mossy stone, solid ground was finally achieved. Collapsing onto the granite, the relief was so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing him into the earth. The roaring of the gorge was behind him. The oscillation of the bridge was gone. The world was still. But the stillness brought clarity to the pain. Lifting the right paw, inspection revealed the cost of the climb. The ice had taken its tithe. One of the claws had been torn away in the frantic scrabble for leverage, ripping the nail bed. The pad was split, a jagged line of raw meat exposed to the freezing air. A drop of blood welled up. It fell. Splish. It hit the pristine white snow. The color was shocking. In a world that had been reduced to grayscale, ash, charcoal, slate, and bone, the red was violently, unapologetically alive. It steamed slightly in the cold. Knox stared at the wound. It was not a fatal injury, but for a pilgrim walking into the teeth of a blizzard, it was a heavy burden. A limp would slow the pace. Slower pace meant more cold. More cold meant the sleep. Licking the paw tentatively, the copper taste of his own blood filled his mouth. It was a grounding flavor. It was the taste of being alive. He stood up. The injured leg trembled, refusing to bear full weight. Turning back, he looked across the gorge. The bridge of ice looked impossible from this side, a fragile glass thread spanning a monster's throat. It seemed absurd that anything living could have crossed it. Beyond the gorge, far below in the valley, the city was visible. It was no longer a sprawling metropolis of stone. From this height, it was a cluster of dark pebbles huddled together in the dark. The bonfires in the market square had burned down to embers, tiny pinpricks of dying orange light. The light was fading. The boy's candle would be next. A low growl rumbled in the cat's chest, not at the wolves nor at the wind, but at the distance itself. Turning away from the view, Knox faced the slope ahead. The tree line had ended. Above lay the alpine zone, a barren landscape of scree, glaciers, and the final, towering ascent to the zenith. He took a step. A droplet of blood marked the snow. He took another red mark. He was painting his path up the mountain, leaving a trail of crimson breadcrumbs that would freeze into rubies within minutes. Limping, head lowered against the returning gale, the ash cat resumed the climb. The bridge was crossed. The blood was paid. Now only the mountain remained. Chapter 5. The Cave of Echoes. The mountain did not tolerate intruders. Having survived the forest and the gorge, the small pilgrim now faced the summit's primary defense mechanism, the whiteout. It began not with a howl, but with a erasure. The sky, previously a dome of oppressive black, descended. Clouds heavy with ice swallowed the peaks, then the slopes, and finally the ground itself. The distinction between earth and air vanished. There was no up, no down, no horizon. There was only white, a swirling, blinding vortex of snow that did not fall, but attacked horizontally, driven by a gale that stripped the breath from the lungs before it could be used. The trail of red blood, the only marker of progress, was buried in seconds. Knox stopped. To move was to wander blind into a void. To stay was to become a statue. He lifted his injured paw. The cold had cauterized the wound, sealing the split pad with a crust of ice, but the ache had migrated deep into the bone, a dull, rhythmic thudding that synced with the shivering of his frame. Squinting against the stinging needles of ice, amber eyes searched for a landmark, a rock, a tree, a shadow. Nothing. The world had been scrubbed clean. Panic, usually a cold knot in the gut, dissolved into a strange, floaty disorientation. The roar of the wind was so constant it sounded like silence. The cold was so absolute it felt like burning. Stumbling forward, driven only by the momentum of the fall, he bumped into something hard. Stone. It was not a cliff face, but a fissure. A narrow, jagged crack in the granite wall that offered a sliver of darkness in the blinding white. A mouth. Instinct urged caution. Caves are the homes of bears and old ghosts. But the wind pushed from behind, a physical hand shoving him toward the gap. He squeezed through. The transition was jarring. One moment, the roar of the storm was a physical assault. The next, it was a muffled, distant drone, like the sound of the ocean heard from underwater. The air inside was still. It was stale, smelling of minerals and deep, untouched time. Knox shook himself, a cloud of snow flying from his coat to settle on the floor. He looked around. This was not a simple den. The walls were not rough stone, but lined with formations of translucent quartz and ice, dripping in slow motion. Faint light filtered in from the storm outside, catching in the crystals, refracting and multiplying until the cave seemed lit by 1,000 dim, ghostly lanterns. It was beautiful. And it was cold. A different kind of cold than the wind. This was a stillness that seeped into the mind. Limping deeper into the recess, away from the draft of the entrance, the ash-gray cat sought a dry patch of floor. He found a smooth slab of slate. Collapsing onto it, his legs simply folded. The exhaustion, held at bay by adrenaline and terror, crashed over him like a breaking wave. He rested his chin on his good paw. The crystals on the walls seemed to watch him. They reflected his image back at him, distorted, fractured, 100 small, gray, broken things huddled in the dark. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, just to warm the blood. The storm raged outside, sealing the entrance with a drift of snow. Inside, the echoes began. Sleep is a traitor in the high mountains. It comes disguised as a friend, offering a cessation of pain and a loosening of the tight knots of anxiety. It whispers that the struggle is over, that the weight can be laid down. As the core temperature of the small body on the slate floor dropped, the shivering ceased. The violent tremors that had racked the frame faded, replaced by a spreading narcotic warmth. It felt like sinking into a bath of heated cream. The ache in the torn paw dissolved. The hunger that had twisted the stomach for days smoothed out into a comfortable numbness. Dreams began to bleed into the waking world. The crystals lining the cave walls were no longer cold stone. They shimmered and shifted, becoming windows into a different reality. In the facets of the quartz, a fire crackled. Not the angry, useless bonfires of the city square, but a true hearth. The flames danced in orange and gold, casting a benevolent heat that seemed to radiate from the stone itself. A scent drifted through the stale air of the cavern, impossible and intoxicating. Roast chicken, warm bread, the dusty, safe smell of a wool blanket. It was the smell of the life Knox had never lived, but had always watched from the window ledges come. The air whispered. It wasn't a wind. It was a voice. Small, familiar. Here, Shadow. Here. Ears twitched in the semi-darkness. Leo. The boy was standing in the reflection of the ice. He looked healthy. His cheeks were flushed with rose, his eyes bright and blue. He held out a hand, not to offer a crumb, but to offer a place on the rug. It's warm here, the boy murmured, his voice echoing from every angle of the cave. You don't have to climb anymore. You can just rest. The temptation was a physical gravity, to close the eyes fully, to let the chin sink onto the paws, to allow the drift to become a permanent voyage. Why fight the storm? Why bleed on the ice? The boy was here. The fire was here. The illusion was perfect. It offered the one thing a street cat craves above all else: belonging. Breathing slowed. The rise and fall of the gray ribs became shallow, spacing out. Inhale. A long pause. Exhale. The heart rate dropped, syncing with the slow geological pulse of the mountain. The boundary between the cave and the dream eroded. The cold slate floor felt like a feather bed. The howling wind outside sounded like a mother humming to her litter. Knox drifted. He floated in a sea of false comfort, the golden light of the hallucination washing over him, burying the memory of the mission under layers of soft, white silence. The Pilgrim was stopping. The fire in the chest was turning to ash. And in the city far below, in a room growing colder by the minute, a real candle sputtered in a pool of wax, preparing to go out. The illusion shattered not with a crash, but with a silent implosion. The dream of the warm room, the crackling fire, the boy's gentle smile. It evaporated like mist in a harsh wind. The cave returned, the vast echoing chamber, the dripping sound of water, the cold hard slate beneath the paws. Knox lay there, shivering, not from the physical cold, but from the chill of betrayal. The paradise had revealed its true nature. It was a trap. A beautiful, perfectly crafted cage, designed to keep the deserving souls from returning to their imperfect but real lives. The temptation was gone, leaving behind a bitter residue. Why did I stop? The thought pulsed in his mind, sharp and accusatory. Why did I listen? He pushed himself up, The movement was agonizing. Every joint screamed in protest. The left hip, already ruined by the fall, felt like it was filled with shards of ice. Looking around the cave, the darkness was no longer a familiar ally. It was an enemy. The shadows in the corners pulsed with a life of their own, moving when his eyes were averted, shifting the very geometry of the space. The crystals on the walls seemed to mock him, their faint light reflecting not the beauty of the stars, but the emptiness of the void. He remembered the words of the elder matriarch. The mountain is not made of rock. It is made of tests. He had faced the wind. He had faced the wolves. He had faced the temptation of false warmth. But this was different. This was the hotel of lost souls, and he had fallen from its rafters. He tried to move toward the entrance, the jagged crack in the rock that led back to the storm, back to the trail of faint scent. But the path had changed. The snowdrift that had blocked the entrance was gone. In its place was a sheer wall of black, polished obsidian, impossibly smooth and sheer. It rose up, blocking the way back, sealing the cave like a tomb. His claws, dulled and chipped from the climb and the fall, found no purchase. He scrabbled against the glassy surface, sending sparks of frozen grit flying, but the wall offered no grip, no hold. Despair began to set in, a cold, creeping numbness that was far more dangerous than the physical cold. He heard the sound again. Not the wolves, not the wind. A soft rhythmic scraping. Scritch, scrape, scritch. From the darkness deeper within the cave, where the ceiling dripped and the shadows gathered, something was emerging. It was not a wolf made of smoke. It was not a dog made of bones. It was something else. Something that moved with the slow, deliberate inevitability of erosion. It looked like a hand. A giant hand made of shifting stone and compacted earth. Its fingers were jagged stalactites, its thumb a massive pillar of rock. It moved with a grinding sound, scraping against the cave floor. Where the fingers touched the ground, the earth turned to dust. The creature was an excavator, a tunneler. It was the mountain itself, animated by malice. It was heading for the wall of obsidian. It was heading for the only exit. Knox was trapped between the cave and the creature. He was small. He was injured. He was alone. He looked at the hand. It was an agent of unmaking. He felt the crushing weight of the mountain above him, the weight of the stone that was now his prison. A single thought, sharp and clear, cut through the despair. You cannot fight the earth, but you can become the shadow. Chapter 6. The Final Ascent. Crushing stone met empty slate. The massive hand of earth slammed down, pulverizing the spot where the Pilgrim had rested only a heartbeat before. But the blow struck nothing but dust. Shadows do not break, they displace. Slipping through a fissure no wider than a whisker, Knox had abandoned the illusion of the cave, squeezing his body through the throat of the rock, until the darkness gave way to a sudden, shocking expansion. He emerged not into the white fury of the storm, but above it. The transition was absolute. Below, a churning ocean of gray clouds boiled, sealing the world of men in its frozen tomb. Above, the sky was a dome of pristine, terrifying obsidian, scattered with stars that burned with a cold, unblinking clarity. There was no wind here. The gale could not reach this height. There was no sound. The silence was a vacuum, sucking the noise from the ears, and there was no air. Knox opened his mouth to gasp, but his lungs found purchase on nothing. The atmosphere was thin, a gossamer veil that offered scant oxygen to a starving bloodstream. He staggered. Dizziness washed over him, a gray tide. The edges of his vision blurred. This was the death zone. The altitude where life is not forbidden, but simply unsupported. Every step became a negotiation with biology. Lift the paw. Place it on the rimed rock. Wait for the heart to flutter 5 times to circulate the meager oxygen. Repeat. The cold here was not a temperature. It was a state of matter. It turned the moisture in his breath to ice crystals instantly, coating his muzzle in a mask of white frost. The tip of his tail was numb, a dead weight dragging behind him. He looked up. The peak, the Zenith, was visible now. It was not a jagged spire, but a smooth, rounded dome of black rock, crowned with a halo of aurora light. It looked close, perhaps 100 yards. But in the thin air, 100 yards is a lifetime. He forced his legs to move. They felt like wood. The trail of blood from his paw had stopped. The wound had frozen shut, sealing the red away. Now he left no mark. He was a ghost, climbing a graveyard. Climb. The instinct whispered, faint and distant. He crawled, belly to the stone, eyes fixed on the black dome. The stars watched him, indifferent witnesses to the slow, agonizing progress of the only warm thing left in the universe. Granite offered no mercy. Rising vertically from the slope, a final barrier of black rock stood between the Pilgrim and the summit. A wall of stone stripped bare by the wind, slick with a glaze of ancient ice. It was not a high wall, perhaps 3 times the height of a man, but in the thin air it was a fortress. Claws, worn down to dull nubs by the miles of city stone and forest bark, scraped uselessly against the surface, scritch, slide. Muscles trembled, depleted of glycogen, burning with the toxic waste of exhaustion. The first attempt failed. Reaching for a fissure, the grip slipped. Gravity, waiting patiently, claimed its due. The gray body tumbled backward, rolling down the scree slope, until coming to rest against a boulder. Pain didn't register. The nerves had long since gone silent, encased in a shroud of frost. Lying in the snow, the sensation was not of suffering, but of a terrible, seductive heaviness. The rock felt soft. The wind sounded like a lullaby. Stay, the mountain whispered. Become part of the stone. Eyelids drooped, heavy with ice. To close them was to die. To stay down was to let the boy's candle snuff out. A memory surfaced, not of the warm bread, but of the cold glass of the attic window, the sight of the blue lips, the gray mist tightening its coil. Rage flickered in the chest, a tiny, sputtering ember. It was not enough to warm the blood, but it was enough to move a limb. One paw extended, then another. Dragging the belly across the sharp scree, the ascent resumed. This time there was no jumping. Finding a crack in the rock, teeth were used where claws failed. Jaws clamped onto a protrusion of stone, neck muscles straining, hauling the dead weight of the body upward, inch by inch. Blood welled in the mouth, salty and hot, freezing instantly on the lips. It was a climb of ugly, desperate necessity, scrabbling, kicking, biting the mountain itself. Halfway up, the wind returned, a sudden downdraft trying to peel the intruder from the face of the wall. Fur flattened, ribs compressed. Holding on with a single leg hooked over a spur of rock, hanging over the white oblivion, the world narrowed down to a single question. How much is a life worth? The answer came from the heart, beating its slow, stubborn rhythm against the stone. Everything. With a final, convulsive heave, the lip of the wall was breached. Collapsing onto the flat plateau above, the Pilgrim lay still, a heap of gray fur dusted with white, indistinguishable from the rocks around him. The wall was conquered, but the body was broken. Flat ground is a luxury the body forgets after hours of vertical struggle. Lying on the plateau, the sensation of stability was disorienting. The world had stopped tilting. The wind had ceased its howling, leaving behind a silence so profound it rang in the ears like a bell struck underwater. Rising required a negotiation with physics that the muscles were reluctant to accept. Limbs stiffened by the frost locked into place, trembling under the weight of the ribcage. The pilgrim stood. He was no longer the ashcat of the city streets. The gray fur was entirely encased in a shell of white rime. The whiskers were brittle icicles. He looked like a statue carved from the mountain itself, animated by a fading spark. Ahead, the plateau stretched out, a smooth obsidian dance floor, polished by aeons of starlight. In the center, rising from the black stone, stood the Zenith. It was not a throne, nor a temple built by hands. It was a single, jagged spire of rock, shaped like a needle, pointing accusingly at the empty space in the sky where the sun had abandoned its post. Around the needle, the rock was scorched, not by fire, but by the memory of ancient, intense heat. This was the resting place of the day. Moving toward it was not a walk. It was a pilgrimage of inches. Paws left no prints on the hard stone. The trail of blood had ended miles below. There was no evidence of passage, only the slow, rhythmic forward motion of a will that refused to extinguish. Reaching the base of the needle, the air shimmered. It wasn't heat. It was the thinness of the veil between the earth and the ether. Collapsing at the foot of the rock, the chin rested on the cold stone. Below, the world of men was invisible. A blanket of churning storm clouds hid the city, the bakery, and the attic window. From this height, the struggles of the ground, the hunger, the cold, the fear, seemed microscopic, but the connection remained. The tether to the boy pulsed in the chest, a faint, rhythmic tug. "I am here," the pulse signaled. "I have reached the roof of the world. There was nothing left to climb. The energy was spent. The reserves were empty." Amber eyes closed, not in sleep, but in waiting. The wind held its breath. The stars seemed to lean closer, curious witnesses to the impossible presence of a heartbeat in the zone of death. Knox waited. He did not call out. He did not beg. He simply offered his presence. A small, freezing sacrifice laid upon the altar of the night. And then, the darkness shifted. Chapter 7. The Ancestor. Silence on the summit was not empty. It was pregnant. The air, previously thin and biting, grew heavy with a sudden static charge that raised the fur along the spine. The obsidian floor of the plateau ceased to reflect the distant stars, absorbing the light instead, pulling the cosmos down onto the rock. From the nothingness, something began to weave itself together. It did not step out from behind a boulder, nor did it descend from the sky. It materialized from the ether, a gathering of mist and starlight that thickened, hardened, and took a breath. A shape emerged, immense, silent, terrifyingly regal. It was a feline, but of a scale that mocked the biology of the earth. Shoulders rose like snow-covered hills. Paws, broad as shields, rested weightlessly on the black stone. It was the snow lynx, the ancestor, the keeper of the Zenith. Its coat was not made of fur, but of the aurora itself, shifting ribbons of pale violet and cold silver that rippled over a musculature of pure energy. Where it moved, the air froze, not with cold, but with time. But it was the eyes that pinned the pilgrim to the ground. They were not amber nor green. They were voids of swirling nebulae, deep wells of creation that held no pupil and no iris, only the slow, turning drift of galaxies. Nox did not cower. The instinct to flee, usually so sharp in the presence of a predator, had been burned away by the climb. There was nowhere left to run. Lying prone at the feet of the giant, the ash cat felt a vibration pass through the stone, a deep, resonant thrumming that was not sound, but presence. The ancestor lowered its massive head. The movement was fluid, a slow cascade of light. The nose, cold and dry as interstellar dust, hovered inches from the small, frozen body. A sniff. It was a gust of wind that smelled of ozone and ancient ice. The ancestor was reading the history written in the scent of the traveler, the smell of the city's soot, the smell of the bakery floor, the smell of the boy's fever, and underneath it all, the metallic tang of the will that had dragged a dying body up the face of the world. Judgment was being passed. There were no words. The ancestors do not speak in the clumsy tongue of the living. They speak in weight. They speak in gravity. A pressure settled over the plateau. A question asked without a voice. Why are you here, little shadow? You are made of mud and hunger. You do not belong in the sky. Contact was made. The nose of the ancestor brushed against the matted, frozen fur of the pilgrim's forehead. It was not a touch of ice, but of fire. Instant shocking heat flooded the veins of the small gray cat. It rushed through the frozen arteries, thawing the blood in a heartbeat, sending a painful, exquisite tingle of life crashing back into the numb extremities. The rime of frost coating the whiskers melted, dripping onto the black stone. The shivering ceased, replaced by a profound narcotic relaxation. The world shifted. The biting wind of the summit vanished. The darkness of the void receded. Around the two figures, a circle of golden light bloomed on the obsidian plateau. It was a hearth without walls, a sanctuary carved out of the storm by the will of the god. The air grew thick with the scent of summer, dry grass, sun-baked earth, and the rich, fatty aroma of fresh prey. You are cold, the thought voice of the lynx resonated, vibrating in the marrow. And you are tired. The climb has taken everything. The ancestor sat back, wrapping a tail of starlight around its paws. Rest, little shadow. You have reached the high place. The struggle is over. A vision manifested within the circle of light. A cushion of moss appeared, soft and deep. A bowl of silver liquid, milk that would never spoil, water that would never freeze, materialized beside it. This is the reward, the ancestor whispered. For the one who climbs, there is the eternal nap. You may stay here. The wind cannot touch you. The hunger cannot find you. You will be the guardian's companion, sleeping in the light of the stars forever. It was the ultimate desire of the street cat. No more fighting for scraps. No more dodging boots. No more shivering in wet alleys. Safety, warmth, permanence. Nox looked at the moss. He looked at the silver bowl. His body, broken and spent, screamed for him to accept. Every cell ached to curl up in that warmth and let the world below fade away. Why go back? The city was stone and spite. The humans were cruel. Here, he was a guest of a god. He took a step toward the cushion. The heat washed over him, seducing his senses. It felt like the hand of the boy, magnified 1,000 times. The boy. The thought acted as a snag, a hook catching on the silk of the illusion. If he stayed, he would be warm. But the window in the attic would freeze over completely. The candle would gutter out. The gray mist would claim the small chest that fought for air. Leo would die in the dark. Nox stopped. He looked at the comfort offered to him. It was a paradise for one. a selfish heaven. He looked at the ancestor. The swirling nebulae in the giant's eyes watched him without judgment, waiting for the choice. To accept the warmth was to abandon the tether. Nox lowered his head. He let out a low, mournful sound. He turned his back on the moss. He turned his back on the silver bowl. He walked to the edge of the circle of light, where the wind still howled and the dark still reigned. He pointed his muzzle down toward the invisible, buried world of men. "No," the posture said, "not for me." The refusal hung in the thin air, heavier than the mountain itself. By turning away from the hearth, the small gray pilgrim had broken the logic of survival. Every biological imperative screams to take the heat, to hoard the energy, to live. To choose the cold is an act against nature. Or perhaps it is an act above nature. The golden circle of light flickered and died. The moss vanished. The silver bowl evaporated into mist. The biting wind returned, howling across the obsidian plateau, instantly refreezing the melted frost on Nox's whiskers. The cold clamped down with renewed violence, punishing the body for the brief interlude of hope. But Nox did not move. He stood at the precipice, looking down into the swirling clouds that hid the dying city. He was shivering violently, his legs threatening to buckle, but his gaze was fixed downward. There, his posture insisted, the warmth belongs there. Behind him, the ancestor shifted. The nebulae in the giant eyes swirled faster, agitation rippling through the starlight coat. The snow lynx lowered its head, bringing its massive face level with the small, trembling back. "You confuse me, little Ash." The voice resonated, deep and vibrating like a cello string. "I offer you the end of hunger. I offer you the end of pain. And you point to the pit." The ancestor looked where Nox looked. The divine gaze pierced the clouds. It saw the frozen streets. It saw the empty chimneys. And it saw the thread. A thin, fragile line of silver light connecting the heart of the street cat to the attic window far below. The tether of the promise. The ancestor understood. "Ah, the spirit breathed, the sound blowing a gust of snow across the rock. "It is not for the stones that you climbed. It is not for the many. It is for the one." Nox looked back. His amber eyes were dimming, the life force ebbing away with the heat. But the defiance remained. "He fed me," the thought projected, simple and absolute. He touched the scar. To a creature of the wild, a debt is a physical weight. It must be paid. The ancestor straightened up, rising to its full, terrifying height. The aurora fur blazed brighter, casting long dancing shadows across the plateau. "The sun does not wake for kings," the ancestor proclaimed. "It does not wake for prayers. It wakes only for will." The giant paw slammed onto the obsidian, cracking the stone. "You, who have known only the cold, have rejected the fire for yourself. You have carried the weight of the shadow to the highest place." The ancestor looked at the eastern horizon, where the black sky met the black earth. A sacrifice has been offered. The balance is struck. The lynx looked down at Nox one last time. There was no pity now, only the respect of one predator for another. "Stand back, Pilgrim. The morning is coming." Chapter 8. The Roar of the Dawn. Turning toward the eastern rim of the world, the great ancestor settled onto haunches woven from pure starlight. The movement was not merely biological, it was tectonic. As the massive paws shifted on the obsidian, the plateau itself seemed to tilt, groaning under a weight that belonged to the stars rather than the earth. Nebula eyes, swirling with the dust of creation, fixed upon the horizon line, that terrible, sealed seam. where the charcoal sky met the dead black earth. It was a scar that had been closed for too long, a wound that refused to bleed light. Silence on the peak deepened. It became a vacuum, a pressurized void that sucked the moisture from the air and pressed against the eardrums. The wind died. The frost stopped creeping. The mountain held its breath, waiting for the command. Then the chest of the lynx expanded. Ribs made of silver aurora flared outward, stretching the fabric of the night. The jaw opened, revealing not a throat of flesh, but a tunnel into the heart of a fusion furnace. The intake of breath was a hurricane in reverse, drawing the stray mists, the cold, and the silence into the cavity of the spirit, and then the release. The roar began. It was not a sound heard with ears. Ears would have shattered. It was a frequency felt in the teeth, in the granite roots of the mountain, in the marrow of the bone. Starting low, a subsonic vibration shook the snow from the lower slopes miles away, triggering avalanches in the dark valleys. It rose, swelling in volume and pitch, becoming a physical wave of golden pressure that blasted outward from the zenith. It was the voice of the first morning, the primal command that separates the day from the void. Wake. The sound wave hit the horizon like a celestial hammer, striking a pane of black glass. Far in the distance, the solid wall of darkness buckled. A fissure appeared in the dome of the sky. A jagged, bleeding line of deep, bruising violet violently tore open the fabric of the eternal night. The roar continued, a sustained note of pure, blinding will, pushing the darkness back, shredding the heavy, leaden clouds that choked the valley floor. Flattening himself against the vibrating obsidian, paws covering sensitive ears, Knox was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the event. The stone beneath his belly hummed with the energy of the waking giant, a resonance that rattled his very skeleton. The crack widened. Violet bled into indigo. Indigo burned away into a shocking, raw crimson. The shell of the night was broken. Through the fissure, a light appeared, not the cold reflection of the moon, but a searing, living fire. The sun, hearing the call of its keeper, began to rise from its tomb. The horizon ignited. Cresting the jagged rim of the world, the upper arch of the sun broke free from the gravity of the dark. It was not the pale, watery disk of winter. It was a furious, blinding gold, searing the retina and painting the underside of the retreating clouds in hues of apricot and blood. For the first time in an eternity, shadows were cast not by the absence of light, but by the presence of it. Long, sharp silhouettes of the peaks stretched westward, racing across the tundra like the hands of a clock restarting time. On the summit, the impact was physical. Piercing the gloom, the first spear of direct sunlight struck the obsidian plateau. It hit the ash-gray Pilgrim. The sensation was a shockwave. After weeks of the numbing, biting, eroding cold, the heat felt heavy. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on the spine. A blanket of hot wool wrapped suddenly around a freezing body. Fur, matted with rime and ice, began to steam. White vapor rose from the small, huddled form, curling up into the thin air as the frost evaporated. The ice sealing the eyes melted, turning into tears that ran down the muzzle. Knox gasped. The air he drew in was no longer sharp glass. It was softened, tempered by the radiation of the star. It tasted of morning. It tasted of survival. Slowly, painfully, he uncurled. Muscles that had been locked in a rigor of shivering loosened. The blood, thick and sluggish, began to flow freely again, carrying the warmth to the tips of the ears and the end of the tail. The ache in the bones did not vanish. Damage is damage. But the suffering changed texture. It was no longer the hopeless, numbing pain of the end. It was the throbbing, burning pain of recovery. He lifted his head. Squinting against the brilliance, he looked at the world. It had color. The black rock was now purple. The white snow was pink. The sky was a gradient of azure and teal. The monochrome nightmare had been shattered by the prism of the dawn. Beside him, the ancestor began to fade. The great lynx did not walk away. It dissolved. As the sunlight strengthened, the starlight of the spirit grew translucent. The nebula eyes lost their depth, becoming mist. But the presence remained, a vibration in the stone, a whisper in the wind. The fire is lit. The thought drifted on the breeze, gentle and final. Carry it down. Nox stood alone on the roof of the world. He was small. He was broken. He was starving, but he was warm. He looked over the edge of the plateau. The light was pouring down the mountain like a golden avalanche. It cascaded over the cliffs, flooded the gorge, and raced through the forest tops, turning the dark pines into torches of green and gold. Far below, the cloud cover over the valley began to tear apart. Through the gaps, the city appeared. It was no longer a cluster of dead stones. The rooftops were gleaming. The ice on the river was cracking, flashing silver. And in the attic window, the frost would be melting. A low, rusty purr started in the chest of the ash cat. It rattled his ribs. He had done it. He had stolen the fire from the sky and given it back to the earth. The summit was empty, save for the light. The ancestor had dissolved completely into the ether, leaving behind only the heat of the promise kept. The silence that remained was not the vacuum of the void, but the rich, heavy quiet of a cathedral after the bells have stopped ringing. Standing on the rim of the world, bathed in the full glorious wash of the morning sun, the ash cat looked down. The path back was a ribbon of gold. Sunlight striking the glaciers and the snowfields turned the terrifying white landscape into a blinding field of diamonds. The ice, which had been a fortress wall on the ascent, was beginning to weep. Drip, drip, trickle. Water, the blood of the mountain, began to flow again. Tiny rivulets of crystal-clear liquid ran over the black rock, singing a quiet song of thaw. Movement required a shift in mindset. The climb had been an act of war against gravity, a violent clawing upward. The descent would be an act of surrender. Nox stepped off the plateau. His legs, fueled only by the residual heat of the god touch, trembled violently. The adrenaline that had masked the damage was fading, revealing the ruin beneath. The paw with the torn claw throbbed in time with his heartbeat. The ribs that had been bruised by the wind ached with a dull, persistent fire. But the air was thick. It was no longer the thin, starving gas of the death zone. As he descended, the atmosphere grew richer, heavier, filling his lungs with the taste of ozone and melting pine resin. He did not walk so much as slide. Gravity, once a tyrant trying to pull him into the abyss, became a gentle hand on his back, guiding him down. He slid over patches of softening snow, his gray fur leaving a furrow in the white powder. Reaching the top of the stone wall, the barrier that had nearly killed him, he found it changed. The ice glaze was slick with water. Instead of climbing down, he let go. He slid. It was a chaotic, tumbling descent, rolling through the scree, bouncing off cushions of moss that were just beginning to thaw. He landed in a drift of snow at the bottom, soft and yielding. He lay there for a long moment, the sun beating down on his flank. He was tired. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion settled over him. It whispered that he could stop here. The sun was up. The world was saved. He could close his eyes in the snowbank and sleep forever, warm and content. But the tether tugged, faint but insistent. The image of the boy in the bed, the need to see the eyes open, to know that the blue lips had turned pink. Not yet, the instinct murmured. The circle is not closed. Dragging himself out of the drift, Knox looked at the forest below. The tops of the pines were glowing. The shadows in the woods were retreating, burned away by the angle of the dawn. The wolves would be gone, driven back into the deep earth by the light they feared. The bridge of ice would be melting, perhaps already gone, forcing him to find the long way around. It didn't matter. Time had returned to the world. The urgency of the eternal night was over. He began to walk. His pace was slow, a limping, rhythmic trudge. He was a small gray speck moving through a world of blinding brilliance. He was no longer the pilgrim seeking a miracle. He was the messenger carrying the news. And though his body was broken, his shadow, cast long and sharp against the snow by the rising sun, looked like the shadow of a lion. Chapter 9. The Silent Return. Light has a weight, but unlike the crushing heaviness of the dark, it is a weight that lifts. As the sun climbed higher, breaking free from the jagged peaks, to claim the center of the sky, the mountain transformed. The terrifying monochrome of the ascent, the black rock and white fear, was painted over with the soft, bruised pastels of the morning. Snowfields, previously flat and dead, sparkled with a million microscopic prisms, reflecting a light so pure it hurt the eyes. The glaciers, ancient rivers of ice that had groaned in the night, now shone with a deep inner turquoise fire, weeping streams of meltwater that cascaded down the cliffs in glittering threads. It was the alpenglow, the moment when the earth remembers. It is alive. Moving through this cathedral of light, the gray pilgrim was a stark anomaly. Knox moved slowly. The frantic, adrenaline-fueled energy of the climb had evaporated, leaving behind a body that was little more than wire and will. His ash-gray fur, matted with mud and dried blood, absorbed the sunlight, but reflected none of it. He looked like a shadow that had forgotten to fade when dawn broke. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. The descent should have been easy, but his legs were stiff, the joints locking with every extension. The cold of the death zone had done its work. The frostbite in his ears and tail tip had turned the flesh hard and senseless. Yet, the air was sweet. It tasted of wet stone and thawing pine needles. It carried the sound of the world waking up. Far below, the silence of the white forest was broken not by the howl of wolves, but by the sharp, clear call of a raven. Caw, caw. It was a sound of life, a sound of continuity. Stopping on a ridge to rest, Knox looked down at his own paws. The ice that had encased them was gone, melted by the warming rock. The wounds were clean. He felt a strange detachment from the pain. It was there, a dull, constant roar in the background, but it felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He was fading. The effort of waking a god requires a fuel source, and he had burned everything he had. But the view was worth the price. Below him, the valley was a bowl of golden mist. The clouds were tearing apart, revealing the green of the pines and the silver ribbon of the river, no longer frozen solid, but cracking, shifting, flowing. The world was breathing again. He closed his amber eyes for a moment, letting the sun warm his face. He did not sleep. Sleeping was for the end. He pushed himself up. The boy was waiting. The window was waiting. With a stumble that became a walk, The ash cat continued down the slope, leaving the high holy places behind to return to the mud and the noise of the living. Entering the tree line was no longer an act of stepping into a tomb. The black forest, which had stood as a wall of iron bars during the night, had softened. The sun, piercing the canopy in shafts of dusty gold, turned the needles from charcoal to a vibrant, living green. Everywhere, the sound of water broke the silence. It was a symphony of thaw, drip, plop, splash. Snow, heavy and wet, slid from the boughs in great soft clumps, landing on the forest floor with the sound of a sigh. The ice that had encased the trunks cracked and fell away, revealing the dark, rough bark beneath. The forest was weeping tears of relief. Navigating this dripping labyrinth required less stealth and more endurance. The snow underfoot was no longer a powder trap. It was a slush, heavy and gray, clinging to the fur and weighing down the legs. Walking through it felt like wading through molasses. Knox moved with a staggered, uneven rhythm. The limp in his right foreleg had become severe, a hitch in his gait that forced his shoulder to dip with every step. He did not look up at the squirrels chattering in the high branches. He did not pause to sniff the deer tracks that crossed his path. These were the concerns of the living, of the creatures who would see another spring. He was a vessel carrying a singular cargo, the memory of the light. Passing the ancient oak, the hollow sanctuary where he had weathered the storm, he paused. The tree looked different in the daylight, less like a witch's hand, more like an old guardian. The claw marks of the wolves were still visible on the bark, deep gouges that wept sap, but the pack was gone. Driven back into the deep fissures of the earth by the rising sun, the shadows had retreated. The monsters of the night could not exist in the clarity of the morning. A sense of profound isolation settled over the ash cat. Around him, the woods were celebrating. Birds called to one another, reclaiming their territories. A fox trotted by, its red coat blazing against the white, carrying a vole in its jaws. Life was returning to the wild, but Knox felt removed from it. He was a gray stain on the tapestry, a relic of the struggle that had just ended. He moved through the celebration like a ghost, unseen and unacknowledged. The trees began to thin. The ground leveled out. Emerging from the edge of the woods, the vast expanse of the tundra stretched out before him. It was no longer a white desert. The snow was receding, revealing patches of brown earth and wet grass. Steam rose from the ground, a mist of warmth greeting the cold air. And there, in the distance, lay the city. It glittered. The slate roofs were wet with meltwater, shining like mirrors. Smoke rose from the chimneys, not the desperate, choking smoke of survival, but the steady, gray plumes of hearths lit for comfort. The gates stood open. To the eyes of the pilgrim, it looked like a mirage, a place of stone and hard edges that suddenly seemed soft. The tether in his chest pulled tight. Home. Not a home of walls, but a home of a person. Lowering his head, he dragged his heavy paws through the mud. The final mile was the longest. The mountain had been a battle. The road back was a funeral march. But he would finish it. He would cross the threshold. He would see the boy in the light. Passing beneath the iron arch of the city gates, the roar of the return hit the ears like a physical wave. Streets, previously tombs of silence and fear, had erupted into a cacophony of relief. Church bells pealed from the high towers, their bronze throats singing a chaotic, joyous rhythm that echoed off the wet slate roofs. Shutters were thrown wide open, banging against the stone walls as neighbors called out names they hadn't spoken in weeks. The city was manic with light. Crowds gathered in the squares, faces turned upward, drinking in the sun like starving men drinking wine. Strangers embraced, weeping openly, pointing at the great golden disk that had returned to its throne. The shadow sickness was breaking, color was flooding back into cheeks that had been gray, strength returning to limbs that had been frozen. Moving through this riot of celebration, a small dark shape went unnoticed, hugging the wall, pressing a matted, mud-streaked body against the rough stones of the foundations. Knox was not seen as a savior. To the humans, he was merely a smudge of filth on a beautiful day, a reminder of the darkness they wanted to forget. A boot swung out, careless, occupying space. Ribs, already bruised from the wind, took the impact. A sharp grunt of air escaped the lungs. Stumbling, sliding in the wet gutter, there was no energy left for a hiss, no will left to bite. Righting himself with a tremor, the crawl continued. The irony was absolute. The creatures he had climbed the sky to save were now the obstacles in his path. They celebrated the heat while kicking the one who brought the fire. But hatred had been left on the mountain. Hate requires fuel, and the tank was empty. There was only a distant, hollow detachment. They were loud, clumsy children, and he was the tired guardian who had locked the door against the night. The path to the bakery stretched out, longer than the ascent of the Zenith. Every cobblestone became a mountain range, every curb a cliff face. Vision began to tunnel. The edges of the world blurred into a soft white vignette, the noise of the bells fading until they sounded like they were ringing underwater. Turning into the alley, the familiar scent of yeast and rain-soaked wood greeted him, a perfume of home. The rain barrel stood in its place. The stack of crates remained undisturbed. And high above, the attic dormer window reflected the blazing sun, shining like a beacon. Stopping at the base of the wall, neck muscles strained to lift the head. The climb to the roof was impossible. Claws were shattered, muscles were water. A sound escaped the throat, not a meow, but a soft, broken chirrup. A call to the one who listened, legs folded. Collapsing onto the wet stones of the alley floor, the journey ended. Here, in the mud, beneath the window of the boy who had shared a crumb, the pilgrim could go no further. Amber eyes closed, letting the sun warm the scarred flank, waiting for the dark to come one last time. Chapter 10. The Hearth of the Sun. High above the wet stones of the alley, the latch of the attic window clicked. It was a small sound, lost amidst the pealing bells and the shouting crowds of the market square. Yet, to the ears of the dying pilgrim, it rang like a thunderclap. The sash was pushed up. Warm, stale air from the sick room rushed out to meet the crisp freshness of the thaw, carrying with it the scent of fever breaking, the smell of sweat drying, and sheets being changed. A face appeared in the opening, framed by the halo of the morning light. It was Leo. The gray pallor of the shadow sickness had vanished, burned away by the return of the dawn. His cheeks were flushed with the rose pink of returning blood. His lips, once blue and cracked, were parted in wonder as he drank in the sight of the golden sky. He leaned out, resting his elbows on the sill, bathing in the heat that had been stolen and then returned. From the mud of the alley floor, amber eyes watched him. Vision was fading, a vignette of gray fog creeping in from the corners, narrowing the world down to that single square of light. Pain had ceased to be a sensation. It was now just a distance, a vast ocean separating the body from the spirit. But the tether held. A soft, rattling breath escaped the cat's chest. It was too weak to be a call, too quiet to reach the roof. Yet, the boy froze. Perhaps it was a movement in the shadows below. Perhaps it was the connection forged by the sharing of a crumb in the twilight. Leo looked down. His gaze swept past the rain barrel, past the crates, and settled on the small, unmoving heap of wet fur near the drain. The smile vanished from the boy's face. Shadow? The whisper drifted down, trembling. There was no movement from the alley. The ash-gray form lay still, blending with the stones, indistinguishable from the debris of the storm except for the slow, shallow rise and fall of the blank. Panic replaced the joy in the window. The boy disappeared from the frame. The sound of running feet thudded on the floorboards inside, a frantic, stumbling rhythm descending the stairs. A back door slammed open, splash. Small rubber boots hit the puddles, scattering the reflection of the sun. Leo fell to his knees in the mud. He did not care about the dirt. He did not care about the baker who might be watching. His hands, warm and trembling, reached out. They touched the matted fur. The shock of the cold body made the boy gasp, but he did not pull away. Instead, he gathered the broken creature into his arms, pulling the wet, muddy weight against the clean wool of his sweater. "I have you," Leo sobbed, rocking back and forth. "I have you. You're cold. You're so cold." Knox felt the lift. Gravity, which had been a crushing enemy for so long, finally let go. He was floating. The smell of the mud faded, replaced by the scent of milk and boy. The warmth of the small chest pressed against his own was a furnace. Opening one eye, the world tilted. The gray stones were gone. There was only the blue of the sky and the blue of the boy's eyes. The pilgrimage was over. The traveler had arrived. Held against the beating heart of the boy, the world slowed to a gentle, rhythmic pulse. The pain that had defined the journey, the throb of the torn paw, the ache of the frozen marrow, the bite of the wind began to recede. It drifted away like smoke clearing from a valley, leaving behind a sensation of weightlessness. Sunlight, unfiltered and glorious, washed over the alley. It warmed the bricks, turned the puddles to gold, and settled on the ash-gray fur of the pilgrim. Knox closed his eyes. The darkness behind the lids was no longer black. It was a deep, resonant orange, glowing with the memory of the Zenith. He felt the boy's tears falling on his head, hot, salty drops of grief. But there was no need for grief. To the wild things, the end is not a wall. It is a gate. And this gate was open. A sound began in the chest of the cat. It started as a hitch in the breath, a rough rattle of air moving through tired lungs. Then it smoothed out. Rumble, thrum, rumble, thrum. The purr returned. It was not the loud, demanding motor of a house cat expecting dinner. It was a low vibrational frequency of absolute contentment. It was a signal to the boy. I am here. I am warm. I am finished. Leo buried his face in the rough fur. Don't go. The child whispered, the words muffled. Please don't go. I have milk. I have a pillow. But the pillow was already here. The milk was the light of the sun itself, the tether that had pulled Knox up the mountain. The silver thread of duty slackened. The tension was gone. The knot was untied. A profound sense of lightness took hold. The physical shell, the body scarred by the bakery broom, and the wolf's tooth felt heavy, a coat that had become too small and was ready to be shed. Knox stretched, not with his legs, but with his spirit. He extended his senses outward, past the boy's arms, past the brick walls, up toward the sky he had conquered. The ancestor was waiting, not as a giant lynx on a rock, but as a presence in the light beams. Come, The warmth whispered, "The cold is over." One final breath was drawn, a deep inhale of the city air, which no longer smelled of spite, but of thawing earth and hope. The breath was released. It did not stop. It continued outward, carrying the spark of the amber eyes with it. The weight in Leo's arms grew still, but it did not grow cold. Even as the life faded from the biology, the heat remained, radiating from the small body like a stone that has sat in the sun all day. It was a heat that defied the winter, a permanent ember left in the care of the child. Knox was gone from the alley, but he had not vanished into the dark. He had stepped into the gold. Seasons turn, wheeling through the cycles of frost and thaw, but in the small garden behind the bakery, winter lost its grip forever. Where the earth was broken to receive the small gray traveler, the soil refused to freeze. Even in the depths of January, when the snow piles high against the fences and the wind strips the trees bare, a patch of ground remains soft and dark. And from this ground, flowers bloom. They are not the pale, fragile snowdrops of the shade. They are dandelions, rough, sturdy, and defiant. Their heads are bright yellow jagged discs, miniature suns blazing against the white drifts. The locals call them lion's teeth. They do not know why they grow there, nor why they never close, even when the night falls. But the boy knows. Leo sits by the patch often, watching the steam rise from the earth. He feels the heat radiating from the ground, a memory of the ember that was carried down from the peak. He is never cold again. The shadow sickness never returned. It was burned out by a transfusion of pure will. Knox is not gone. He has simply changed states. He is no longer bound by the heavy gravity of bone and hunger. He has become the nap in the sunbeam. Whenever a cloud parts on a rainy day and a shaft of golden light hits the carpet, he is there. Whenever a radiator ticks with heat in a quiet room, he is the vibration. He is the silence that protects the house. He is the assurance that the dawn will always break the shell of the night. The pilgrimage is finished. The mountain is just a silhouette on the horizon now, a conquerable thing. And now the story settles, like dust motes drifting in a shaft of afternoon light. The image of the city fades. The sound of the bells quiets. There is only the warmth. It surrounds you, heavy and golden. It wraps around your shoulders like a quilt fresh from the dryer. You have walked the long road. You have faced the cold. But the door is closed now. The wind is on the other side. Here, in the sanctuary of your own rest, the fire is lit. Let the weight of the day slide off. Let the muscles loosen. Let the breath become long and slow, matching the rhythm of the seasons. Inhale the light. Exhale the shadow. The ash cat is watching. The sun is guarding the gate. Nothing can touch you here. You are safe. You are warm. You are home. Drift. Sink. Sleep. Sleep.